to the Badlands.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Badlands Sci-Fi And Dystopian Shorts podcast. In every episode, I'll be bringing you sci-fi and dystopian short stories. Some episodes will feature longer stories, and probably one per episode, and some episodes will feature shorter stories, but maybe 2 or 3 per episode. If you have any stories that you'd like to hear featured on the show, please send a PDF of the story to thebadlandsshorts@gmail.com. I'll do my best to get back to everyone that submits a story. The Badlands Shorts are on most social platforms, so say hi if you see us out there. If your podcast provider allows you to rate or comment on the show, I'd really appreciate the support. And now, waffling aside, here's this episode's story. Here's your trigger warning for strong, intense imagery and gore with a light smattering of swear words. Probably don't listen around children, especially not if you're liable for their future therapy bills. This story fits neatly into the cosmic horror genre and requires a strong stomach. Enjoy. The Fruits of Gallacas by Don Huxley. Chapter 1. Jansen was really beginning to shred my last nerve. If it wasn't the constant slurping of his coffee, his noodles, the 400 cups of water he drank a day, it was the gratingly irritating sound he made immediately after every slurp. Now he had found something even more teeth-clenchingly annoying to add to the repertoire that made me fantasize about throwing him out of the airlock into the dank jungle outside. He'd been scratching his left hand on and off every half minute or so for the last 3 hours, and it showed no signs of easing up. "Are you okay, Jansen?" I said, nodding towards his flushing hand, doing my best to mask my gently simmering anger.
"Yeah,"
he said unconvincingly whilst looking down at his hand. He looked up to make fleeting eye contact with me, sensing my mood, and said,
"My hand is itchy."
as if I couldn't tell what was blatantly staring me in the face. "I figured," I continued, involuntarily flicking my eyebrows upwards. "What is it, do you think?" I said, turning my swivel chair around to face him.
"Not sure,"
he said, looking down. I could instantly tell he was desperately resisting the urge to scratch his hand once again. He pushed back on his chair and rose to his feet, turning and heading towards the exit of the lab.
"I'll see if there's anything in medbay that will help out,"
he said, as the door slid open to grant him access to the service corridor. The door slid quietly closed behind him, and I turned back to my screen. The work was nearly as dull as Jansen was irritating. I was in my 7th week of logging and classifying insects and soil-bound invertebrates. The first week had been quite interesting, discovering some fairly novel species. But this far along, excitement had given way to repetition. I wasn't even supposed to be in this swamp. I'd been moved sideways, or demoted if I'm being really honest, after an accident involving a docking bay and an excavator. The clumsy-looking 8-wheel vehicle hadn't been properly secured, and while it wasn't my mistake, the final checks were my responsibility, and I knew I'd screwed up when I watched the 18-ton machine slide into a bulkhead, piercing the inner skin of the docking bay. The resulting breach was fixed by spider bots almost immediately, but as I watched them scurry into position and begin welding the tear shut, I knew a shitty job was soon to appear in my future. And here we were, camped out in a 4-room biohab on the equator of Kepler 7b's largest moon, Gallacas, a disgraced bioscience officer and a noodle-slurping idiot. We had another 5 weeks to go before we were relieved, and time, if anything, appeared to be slowing down. I hadn't seen my boys in nearly 18 months, and I was really beginning to wonder if escaping the choked earth had been worth this price. Chapter 2. I powered my display off and rose slowly up from my chair, gently stretching out my spine. I rubbed my tired, watery eyes and headed towards the exit. As I shuffled awkwardly into the cramped service tunnel, I craned my neck to look into the medbay and washroom module. Jansen was still in there apparently, rummaging around in the medication drawers. His back was turned and he seemed to be clumsily raking through the contents of each drawer in turn. He'd been in the med bay for over 2 hours, so I was confused as to how he hadn't already identified something useful to ease his skin ailment. "What's going on, Jansen? Haven't you found something yet?" I started through the opening door. Jansen twitched and looked back over his shoulder.
"I tried some steroid cream, but it's made it worse. That's why I came back in,"
he said, his voice tense with stress. "Let me see," I said, walking towards him. He instantly cowered away, breaking eye contact with me. "Stop being a baby, show me your hand," I insisted.
"Leave me alone, Ryota,"
he said, shuffling away from me. I stepped around him and grabbed at his hand. He tried to withdraw, but I had a firm grip around his wrist. I strained my eyes to try and identify the problem. Jansen stopped resisting and let his arm go slack. I focused in and noticed several dark, equidistant bumps on his index finger. They resembled black grains of rice under the top layers of skin. "It looks like you've been bitten by something," I said, trying to figure out how that was remotely possible. Both the HAB and each worker were flash sterilised on each rotation, meaning it was impossible for any foreign contaminants to make it in or survive within the sealed environment. Jansen appeared sheepish and failed to comment or provide any further insight into the strange occurrence. He jerked his hand back and got up to leave. "Jansen, what the fuck is going on?" I said, raising my voice as he walked towards the door. "The only way you could have been bitten is if there is a leak in the HAB, or one of us has been outside," I continued, following him towards the kitchen rec module. "Dana, generate a report of hull integrity for the HAB," I said as we both walked into the module. The smooth, bland voice of the HAB computer replied,
100% integrity maintained. Positive pressure at 100.8%. O2 levels 21%.
"Okay, Dana, stop," I shouted. Silence returned. "Anything you want to tell me, Jansen?" I said coolly. Jansen remained silent, staring at the sink on the far side of the room. "Dana, report on extra habitat excursions on this rotation," I continued.
"Dana, stop,"
said Jansen in a resigned voice. After several moments, in a subdued retort, he said,
"I only went out the once."
"Jansen, you idiot," I spat.
"I followed protocol,"
he said almost apologetically. "The protocol is to not go out," I shouted, beginning to lose my temper. "What were you thinking?" I continued, not really interested in an answer.
"I was getting cabin fever, being stuck in here with you,"
he replied, shrugging. I collected myself and paced up and down for a few moments. "We need to contact control and get some direction on this," I said, thinking more concisely. "You can sleep in the lab. We don't have the facility for a full quarantine, but I don't want to be anywhere near what's going on with that," I said, gesturing at his blemished finger.
"Fine,"
said Jansen resignedly. "We have 18 hours until broadcast angle," I said, turning to leave the kitchen to head towards the sleep quarters. "Either you get that cleared up or we're making a full report to control." Chapter 3. I was awoken by the sound of Jansen rapping repeatedly on the window of the sleeping quarters.
"Ryota, wake up, something's happened,"
shouted Jansen urgently through the glass. I sat up slowly and rubbed my eyes. I wondered if I managed to will it enough that Jansen would simply go away and stop complaining. Sadly, the continued hammering on the door put pay to this theory. I released the digital deadbolt system on the door and gestured Jansen to back up. I pulled a shirt on and ushered him back down the corridor to the lab. "What's the problem?" I asked, still rubbing the sleep from my eyes as we both shuffled back into the lab.
"Look at this, what the fuck is that?"
hissed Jansen, holding his hand towards me. I recoiled instinctively and tried to focus my sleep-addled vision on the outstretched limb. The 6 lumps on Jansen's index finger had become swollen and were protruding from the finger, approximately the size of small dried peas. One of the lumps had seemingly burst, and a small, fibrous, black, rigid-looking thread protruded from the pus-streaked wound. I squinted to get a clearer look and then reached into a nearby drawer for some nitrile gloves. Unconsciously, I leaned back as I took Jansen's hand in mine and peered closer. Preposterously, the thin, rigid thread was jointed in the middle, resembling something akin to a spider's leg. I peered up at Jansen. His worried face stared back at me. I shrugged and dropped his hand to go and search the drawers for some surgical scissors. I returned with the implement and gestured to Jansen to give me his afflicted hand back. He offered it up reluctantly, asking,
"What are you doing?"
"Are you particularly fond of that thread, Jansen?" I said, nodding to the protrusion.
"No, but do you know what you're doing?"
he asked, a note of panic rising in his voice. "You either want to keep that thing in your finger or you don't," I said, raising my eyebrows whilst avoiding the question.
"Okay, do it,"
he said, looking away. I slowly slid the blades of the scissors around the black needle-like object and began to squeeze. To my horror, as I snipped through it, the remaining stump began to writhe and spasm, seemingly in an attempt to evade further harm. I dropped his hand and recoiled, the revulsion obviously painted on my face, as when Jansen caught sight of it, he went white and screeched,
"What? What's the problem?"
I took his hand again and looked at the wriggling stump. Somehow, it had regrown half of its length again, and the tiny joint was regrowing at the end of the stump. "Jansen, it looks like some sort of subcutaneous parasite," I said, squinting as I watched it continue to regrow. At that moment, one of the spots on the other side of the finger popped, exuding a watery pus and another small black needle. I gasped involuntarily, and Jansen now forced himself to look at the finger. He let out a strangled scream and his eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. I backed up and started looking through cabinets and drawers for something, anything that I could use to help the issue. Various scalpels and probes rattled around as I shook open the drawers, but I didn't in truth really know what I was looking for. As I conducted my search, I heard Jansen screech again, then again, and when I returned my attention to his finger, it appeared that it now had 5 of the needle-like limbs protruding from the pustules. Jansen looked at it and then at me with an expression of blind panic written across his face. I watched in horror at what I now understood to be legs as they began to skitter and writhe in mid-air. Jansen held his hand as far away from his body as he could possibly manage and stared at me pleadingly. As we watched, I noticed his finger begin to darken and bruise at the knuckle. Jansen began to shout in pain, and he at first grabbed the afflicted hand and then released it in horror as the legs began to try and claw at his other hand. As he held it out in front of him, a small tear opened up at the tip of the finger, and minuscule pin-like teeth began to emerge at each side of the tear, forming a grotesque tiny mouth. Almost immediately, the finger, seemingly no longer under Jansen's control, bent almost completely back on itself. The accompanying grinding and snapping caused Jansen to scream. Frozen with helpless indecision, I could only watch as the proto mouth on the end of Jansen's finger began to gnaw at the rapidly necrotizing flesh at the knuckle. He stumbled backwards and forwards, colliding with benches and stools, until with one pointed scream he froze on the spot. The thing which used to be his index finger chewed through the last of the sinew and connective tissue at the knuckle and promptly dropped to the floor. We both stared at it in dumb disbelief as it skittered to its feet and began to retreat to a corner near the crash trolley.
"What the fuck is going on, Ryota?"
implored Jansen, cupping the remainder of his bloodied hand. I scanned the room and saw the CO2 extinguisher near the entrance door of the lab. I retrieved it and pulled the retaining pin out. I edged towards the corner of the room, pulling aside the crash trolley gently. The corner skirting of the whole room was banked like a wet room, and sure enough, the spider finger was trying and failing to climb up the wall. I approached carefully and at once pulled the trigger on the extinguisher, aiming the jet directly at it. Tiny hissing screeches emanated from it, presumably from the mouth, and its movements appeared to slow down in between the billowing clouds of CO2. After I was satisfied it was incapacitated, even if just temporarily, I turned my attention to the med cabinets lining the wall and began searching for the cauterizing torch I knew was there somewhere. After a few minutes of searching, periodically looking over to see if the spider finger was still immobile, I located the torch and began priming the gas tap. As I walked over, I toggled the ignition and the blue flame began dancing into a tiny spot. I applied the flame to the body of the spider and held it steady as the thing began to writhe between frozen paralysis and white-hot immolation. Finally, after a minute or so, it appeared to be dead, and the room filled with a sweet stink of burned flesh. I grabbed a large sachet of hypochlorite and approached Jansen. Despite his tearful protestations, I rinsed his open wound with the solution, which fizzed a little, and I winced at his stifled shouts. After this, I sank to the floor to gather my breath and my thoughts.
Help me dress this,
Grimaced Jansen, holding up the stump. I fetched crepe bandage and tape from one of the drawers and got to work. My medical training was barely greater than simple first aid, but I managed a fairly neat dressing over the ragged stump, and on its inspection, Jansen nodded in resigned approval. Chapter 4. 12 hours to broadcast angle. Another 4 hours at very least for a recon shuttle to be dispatched and delivered to our hab from the orbiting workstation Miri. Until then, we were very much on our own. When Control learned of the situation, would they even grant us a medevac? How are you feeling now, Jansen? I asked, knowing full well what the answer would be.
in pain, missing a finger, and freaked the fuck out.
He spat. Understandable, I said. That was a lot. Let me locate some painkillers, I continued, as I got up to rifle through the med drawers. I located a few vials of nano anti-inflammatories and loaded a pressure gun. I approached Jansen and gestured him to roll up his sleeve. As he did so, what I saw caused me to stumble back and tumble backwards over a stool.
What, Ryota, what?
He screeched as I clambered to my feet and attempted to regain my composure. I edged forward and nodded to his forearm, now replete with 6 blinking reptilian eyes. As his eyes connected with his recently added eyes, he once again started to scream. I couldn't even blame him. This was getting surreal. I lurched towards the door and made my way to the kitchen module as fast as I could manage. On the wall, mounted on magnetic strips, sat a few food prep knives and a cleaver, none of which had been used to this point. I grabbed the cleaver and made my way back to the lab. As I appeared through the door, Jansen saw the cleaver and immediately started backing up. "We have a tough decision to make, Jansen," I said, approaching him slowly. "Either we get rid of that arm above the elbow, or you risk losing more of whatever that is."
Fucking hell, do you even know what you're doing?
He barked. I did not. I waved the pressure gun, loaded with painkillers, at him and gestured him to approach the waist-height bench. He crept over slowly, grimacing. When within range, I pressed the gun towards his neck and delivered the maximum dose of painkillers. I then pinned his arm to the bench, trying not to make contact with the narrow blinking eyes in his forearm. Lumps appeared on the underside of his forearm, and I could only guess at what they would develop into, given enough time. "Bite on this," I told Jansen, handing him a towel, and I picked the cleaver back up.
Wait,
Implored Jansen, but I gestured for him to put the towel between his teeth and swung the cleaver high, bringing it to bear just above his elbow joint. There was a sickening crack of bone and wet cracking of cartilage as the cleaver made it about 3/4 of the way through the limb. Jansen let out a guttural scream as the towel dropped out of his mouth and he promptly lost consciousness. I raised the cleaver once more and swung down on the remaining sinew still connecting the forearm. The forearm was freed and rolled quickly off the bench and flopped noisily to the floor. As I retrieved the cauterizing torch, the bumps on his forearm stretched out, splitting the skin to reveal stubby tentacles. These slick appendages immediately started to search out a way to balance the rest of the mass on the lab floor. Before it could progress any further, I fired the torch and went to work, first vaporizing each eye in turn and then starting on the newly birthed limbs to ensure its incapacitation. After a few minutes of systematic burning, I was satisfied that the thing was dead, or at least catastrophically wounded. I glanced at Jansen, slumped over the bench, still unconscious. I retrieved a rubber tourniquet from a cabinet, tied off Jansen's arm, and went to work on the stump with the cauterizer. The pain roused him briefly, permitting him to scream half-heartedly until he once again passed out. Once I was satisfied that the wound had stopped bleeding and was as sealed as I could manage, I gathered up the spider corpse and the charred remains of Jansen's forearm and loaded them into the waste compactor. Chapter 5. 9 hours to broadcast angle. As Jansen was still unconscious, I decided this would be a good time to search his body for any new outbreaks. Was this a parasite? Parasites normally used a host as a nutrition source, but this was more complex. Whatever this was, it was more than a traditional parasite. It appeared to be using Jansen's body as not only nutrition, but also as a donor, not growing inside Jansen's body as much as it was occupying and adapting it. The thought nauseated me. I began to theorise about the pathology of this being. Was it airborne, formite, or contact transmission? Was I already infected? How had it gotten into Jansen? As I pondered this, I began to scrabble my sleeves up and lift my shirt tails to inspect my body. Nothing. Yet. With this in mind, I changed the gloves on my hands and moved over to Jansen's slumped body. I lifted his shirt carefully, trying not to rouse him, and searched for any further progression of the infection. His previously unaffected arm appeared to be growing scales, growing thicker, darker and denser as they progressed up his arm. I immediately let go of his sleeve and backed up. Was it adapting to the threat? This was a disturbing idea. How did it learn? Where was the consciousness based? Was there a consciousness? I was making peace with the fact that Jansen was not going to get out of here, short of a miracle. If I wanted to get out of here unscathed, I had some fairly stark choices to make. I would need to seal Jansen in a module and lie to Control about the situation. This was not going to improve my career trajectory. At this point, I'd settled to get out of here in one complete parasite-free piece. Chapter 6. 5 hours to broadcast angle. How did this happen, Jansen? I asked as he woke up. He was groggy and his eyelids were heavy. The anti-inflammatories should not have had this effect. Were you bitten outside? I asked, trying to make contact with his drunk-looking eyes.
Or suit,
he said, looking around.
Took it off an airlock,
he said, suddenly becoming aware of his scaly, almost armoured arm.
Fuck,
he slurred, pulling up his sleeve clumsily. Don't worry, Jansen, I have a plan, I lied, trying to get him to his feet. Let's get you back to the sleep mod, and you can rest up a bit while I make arrangements. Jansen staggered unsteadily to his feet, and I picked up the pressure gun and followed him to the sleeping quarters. As he slumped on the bed, I applied the gun to his neck and again applied the maximum dose. Rest up, I'll check on you soon. As I retreated from the sleeping module, I closed the door behind me and retrieved the cauterizing torch. I fired it up and applied it to the locking mechanism, only hoping that it had disabled both sides and not just my side. I knew my actions were callous, but survival mode was taking over, and I knew Jansen would never be retrieved from here. Control was more likely to incinerate the whole site if they learned of what had occurred. I knew in my heart of hearts that I should tell the truth and submit to full quarantine down here, but I was not prepared to breathe my last in this fetid swamp 4 light years from home, from Earth, from my boys. I'd worked hard my whole career and I was damned if it was going to end like this. Chapter 7. I was awoken again with a heavy thumping coming from the direction of the sleep module. I rose up uncomfortably from the bench where I'd slumped earlier. I crept tentatively up the service corridor to peer through the porthole into the room. Jansen was on his feet, swaying unsteadily, and when he saw me, he rushed over to the porthole.
Help me, Ryota,
he slurred, pulling up his sleeve to reveal not just scales, but greenish, heavy-looking organic armour. Below the scales, tiny legs akin to those of a millipede flailed and pulsed. I tried not to show my revulsion, but it must have been fairly evident.
Why doesn't the door work?
He wailed. I can't help you if we're both sick, Jansen, I lied again. I'm calling for help, hang tight, I said, ready to back up. As I said this, a sickening crunching sound emanated from the comm speaker. I peered back in as Jansen hit the deck, and I had to strain to see him. The armoured limb began to sever itself from the rest of Jansen's body, and he slipped into unconsciousness as the ripping and tearing intensified. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't retreat. Transfixed, I watched it detach itself and glide smoothly away on its sea of tiny legs. Chapter 8. 2 hours to broadcast angle. I could hear various thumping noises coming from the sleeping quarters and was very reticent to approach, but knew I needed to stay across the situation. As I approached, I sensed movement from multiple areas in the room. Jansen was slumped in a chair, now devoid of both arms. Where had his other upper arm gone? He was bloated and seemingly unconscious. I watched as the scaled armoured worm worked away in a corner, seemingly attempting to burrow at the wall to the service corridor. As I watched, Jansen appeared to sit up slowly, his eyes unfocused and now staring in opposing directions. "Jansen," I said, toggling the comm panel. He twitched, but otherwise made no sign of comprehension. As I stared at him, he appeared to convulse, and after a few jerky spasms, he vomited. This was not normal vomit, though. As I squinted to focus, I noticed that the vomit was pulsating unnaturally. As I looked closer, I realised the vomit was alive. It comprised of a slimy, milky viscera and tiny insect, almost crustacean creatures, clambering and squirming to get free from the fluid. As they did so, they scattered over the floor and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jansen's puke-covered corpse gently twitching in the chair. I'd seen enough. I stumbled backwards to the lab and called up the fire zone containment program on the HAB control console. My fingers were shaking as they singled out sleeping quarters. I decided to start with the CO2 flood into the room. I could see most of the room through the monitor cam, so I deployed the flood and waited for the clouds of CO2 to clear. Minutes passed, but as the clouds cleared, I could see movement. The armoured thing was still attempting to burrow through the wall and appeared to be making progress. I walked to the corridor to make sure it had not made it through. It was intact for the moment, but I could hear scratching coming from this side of the wall. Time to go full tilt, I thought to myself. I toggled the hard purge option, which would send an inflammable vapour into the air, which would then ignite. I hoped this would kill anything on the other side. I was sure what was left of Jansen would not hold this against me. I deployed the vapour and waited until it had permeated the whole lab. I triggered the purge button, and the resulting ignition caused the whole HAB to shake. The accompanying sound was muffled. I shuffled back to the sleeping quarters porthole and peered inwards. A thin layer of smoke hung in the air. Some loose papers were still alight, and blackened embers floated in the air. The scratching of the burrowing armoured creature had stopped. As I edged to the porthole, I reflexively jerked backwards as several millipede-looking creatures crawled across the glass on the other side. And then the scratching resumed, sluggishly at first and then back to full intensity. As the smoke cleared, I saw the armoured creature continuing, as if nothing had occurred, its armour shell smoking and smouldering. I was out of options. Chapter 9. Broadcast angle window commenced. I tapped at the keyboard to initiate the broadcast antenna alignment. The dish on the top of the HAB began to manoeuvre noisily, the vibration audible through the ceiling of the lab. I had to walk a tightrope now when communicating with control. If I was honest about what had happened here, I would not be picked up, and in a worst-case scenario, they would write the site off, dropping me off some supplies and abandoning me for good, or arguably worse, flatten the site with a vacuum bomb. I decided to tell Control that there had been an unexplained fire in the HAB that had killed Jansen and threatened to engulf the whole structure. I tapped away, hoping my story would hold together. I fantasized about being back on the Miri, taking a hot shower and sinking a cold beer, sending messages back and forth with my boys on Comlink. I had some major hurdles to negotiate before that could become a reality. Control returned messages asking for a more detailed sitrep on the fire and the circumstances of Jansen's death. I cooked up the most convincing fabrication I could muster. I wasn't even sure Jansen was dead in the traditional sense of the word, but I knew he wasn't coming home. Control eventually dispatched the surface shuttle to my coordinates, but assured me I'd face a disciplinary regarding the damage to the HAB. At this point, I didn't care. I just wanted away from here, as far away as was humanly possible. There was a loud snapping sound from the service corridor, and a brief investigation revealed that the armoured thing had finally chewed through the wall. Its stumpy head poked partially through and continued to chew the ragged hole, making it bigger by the minute. Through the gaps crawled the vomit bugs like a tide, and I took this as a cue to retreat to the lab and seal the door. Only a few minutes later, the vomit bugs were crawling over the porthole and searching for a way in. In 2 hours, the shuttle would be here. Would the lab keep them out for that long? I opened the airlock door, the only access to the outside. Inside, I could see the environment suits. Which one had Jansen used? Was it contaminated? Closing the airlock door and returning to the control console, I triggered a decontamination shower in the airlock. This was primarily for bacteria and particulate, but I hoped it would flush anything undesirable lurking in the airlock. There was a banging from the service corridor, and I went to see what had happened. The hole in the sleeping quarters wall was now easily 2 foot across and nearly as tall. As I watched, something large began to squeeze through the hole. I couldn't recognise what it was initially, and it wasn't something I'd seen to this point. A fleshy limb pulled through, and then another, dragging a large pink body behind it. To my horror, I realised it was Jansen's torso, severed at the waist but nearly healed. The limbs that pulled it through contained what I assume must be eyes as it peered round as it emerged from the hole. Jansen's head emerged last, shriveled and lifeless at the rear of the creature. 2 more limbs had grown from his arm stumps. These also featured eyes that peered round independently of one another. The grotesque troop of body part creatures loped up the service corridor, probing for weaknesses as they progressed. I retreated to the airlock and began to pull on a suit, checking the O2 levels. Enough for an hour, which meant I should just make the shuttle's arrival. I began to think about how I might burn down the remainder of the hab and finally destroy the new zoo of creatures that had transformed Jansen's body. There were some hand torches with lithium batteries. Maybe if I stacked the remaining O2 cylinders next to the torches and set the cauterizing torch to pierce the batteries, the resulting fire would set off the O2 cylinders. In the absence of any better plan, I set to work constructing this rudimentary bomb. I grabbed the comm tablet and put it in a tack bag. The environment suit made my movements clumsy, but I felt time was running out as the creatures worked against the wall of the lab. When I was ready, I visually checked my escape route and prayed that the housing on the batteries would give me enough time to make it out of the airlock and into the jungle outside to a safe distance. I took a deep breath, fired the torch and positioned it in front of the lithium-powered hand torches. 5 O2 cylinders lay leaned up against the bench. I could only pray that the heat from the pierced torch batteries would be enough to rupture the tanks. I waddled awkwardly out into the airlock, closed the door behind me and triggered the exterior timer to unlock. Finally, I was outside, and I trudged through the undergrowth as fast as was possible. My lungs began to heave, and the oxygen-rich gas mix made my head spin. Finally, I reached the artificially cleared landing zone and turned back towards the hab. Nothing. Minutes passed and I realised that the cauterising torch must have failed to ignite the lithium batteries. As I theorised what must have happened, there was a white flash, like an old-fashioned camera flash, and a massive bang. The concussion of compressed air threw me to the ground, and I watched the hab explode into livid flames. I hoped those creatures were busily incinerating inside. Would the armoured ones survive and seek me out? The next 40 minutes felt like hours, but eventually I saw a light moving in the sky, and as it grew, I recognised the outline of the surface shuttle descending towards the landing zone. I retreated to the edge of the zone and watched as the automated craft touched gently down, its plasma engines crackling as they cooled. I wasted no time and boarded, closing the hatch behind me as quickly as I could. I watched the hab from this elevated position as it continued to burn, black smoke winding into the sky. The biometric controls read my retinas and I strapped myself into the seat. I allowed myself to breathe deeply as the shuttle began its ascent. "Goodbye, Jansen. I'm sorry I couldn't help you," I thought as I saw the hab site shrinking as we climbed upwards. It didn't feel right to think of myself as lucky. This had been the most grueling and horrifying 24 hours of my life, and Jansen's for that matter, but I'd made it. Soon I'd be safe on the Miri. It didn't matter if they sent me to prison, at least I was safe. It was exactly at this moment that I felt my index finger begin to itch. That concludes the reading of The Fruits of Gallacas by Don Huxley. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Was Ryota a callous bastard, or would you have done the same thing? Remember, if you have a short story to share or any suggestions, email us at thebadlandsshorts@gmail.com. See you next time.
You are now leaving the Badlands.